All right, Daniel, are you ready to go, sir? You look like you're ready to go. I like the backdrop. I'm now wondering what's behind the curtain.
Not telling.
No one will ever know. Yeah. All right, with that, sir. All right, well, take it away then.
All righty. Well, thanks, everybody. My name is Daniel Schwalbe. I'm the Deputy CISO and Director of Engineering at Farsight Security. We do passive DNS. And so, not super unsurprisingly, I am going to talk a little bit about DNS today, and most importantly, the battle of the DNS control plane. I'm going to probably save questions till the end. I've got Discord open. If somebody really wants to, have a question answer right then, right there, might be able to do that. But in general, probably going to try to save questions till the end. All right. So what this talk is about: DOH, DNS-over-HTTPS, and DOT, DNS-over-TLS, are certainly on everybody's mind if you're in InfoSec or adjacent. And so the reason I put this talk together is because I'm actually oftentimes surprised how little our fellow security professionals have actually given this thought. And so we're going to talk about aspects of performance, security, network management, and privacy when it comes to DOH and DOT, which DNS-over-TLS. And at the end, I'll offer some personal opinion why I think one or the other are better, or what sort of the caveats are that really people don't necessarily talk about. The key points here, my hypothesis is encrypted resolution services cause as many problems as they solve. I have to put out the obligatory disclaimer that Farsight Security, my employer, we collect passive DNS above the recursor, and so we have no qualms about encrypted resolution if your threat model supports that. And the second disclaimer, after some feedback at a previous version of this talk, is that Farsight encourages the use of query minimization. So QName minimization, meaning the resolver no longer sends the full original QName to the upstream name server. We support that. So that's one way you can kind of limit giving away the whole farm when you're making queries. But that's an implementation issue, and it's not going probably as well as it should be. So why would you encrypt your name resolutions? Traditional DNS, as it's been around for nearly 40 years, sends a query in plain text. So if somebody is on your local network, they could sniff that. If they are in the path between you and your ISP, if you're using a resolver that's on the open internet, that information could be intercepted, and so somebody can see what DNS queries you're making, which is a pretty interesting source of intelligence. There might be some information in there that you might not want other people to know, what websites you visit between you and your browser. So the typical threat models in this situation are, I don't trust my ISP. My ISP is evil. I only have one or two to choose from, so it's not like I can just switch to whoever I want, and they're monitoring all my traffic. I don't want them to see what I'm doing. Okay. Next threat model, I don't trust my government. Okay, depending on where you live, that you may have good reason, or you may just be of the persuasion that, government should stay out of my business no matter what, and I don't want them to know what I do, what I am doing on the internet, so you don't trust it. Okay, that's another pretty common approach. Some people don't trust their employer, or their roommate, or the local coffee shop where they use the free Wi-Fi. Okay, there's a whole bunch of things to unpack there, but ultimately, those are reasonable threat models for some people. If you are on your employer's network and you're, wanting to browse the web, you're probably violating some kind of policy if you're worried about what they may or may not be able to see. But regardless, that's another threat model worth discussing. And then finally, there are people who don't trust large cloud providers. I don't. I'm cloud averse, but cloud does many wonderful things for lots of people, and there are certainly useful applications for that. But ultimately, I have a bit of a distrust in terms of the data that is being collected through cloud services and what people end up doing with it. So those are the kind of threat models worth considering when we're talking about why somebody might want to encrypt their name resolutions from their local client until they get the answer back. As far as encrypted resolver options go these days, there's DOT, DNS-over-TLS, which uses TLS encryption between your local host and your recursive resolver. it has to be supported by the resolver, and it requires some changes to your software locally to facilitate that encryption, and it's between you and the resolver. Then there's DOH, and by the way, DOT is RFC 7858. DOH, DNS-over-HTTPS, is RFC 8484, and it bypasses the traditional name resolution path and puts the question in an HTTP packet, which gets sent over a TLS encrypted HTTPS session over port 443 to a resolver that ports type of name resolution. The resolver unpacks the HTTP packet, looks into it, does the recursive lookup there, puts the answer back into an HTTP packet, and sends it back using TLS encryption to typically your browser, and then your browser can use the answer it got and reach the resource you're trying to connect to. There are other options to keep your name resolution traffic from prying eyes. You could be using a VPN, so that usually bypasses any visibility of your local resolver because it tunnels out, and then your resolutions are originating from the endpoint where the VPN is hosted. That kind of gets around local ISP visibility, but of course you have to trust your VPN provider because they can see everything you do. Tor is certainly an option, although it has other problems. It's still pretty sluggish to use in my experience. You have to install software for that, and while it can hide where you're originating from, you still are only as secure as the exit node that you're popping out from. And if somebody's monitoring that, if you're not using additional encryption for your name resolution at that point, then the exit node operator can see what names you look up. There are some other options. However, I got asked this question a few times. DNSSEC has nothing to do with encrypted resolver option. That is, DNSSEC is to secure your zone records, but it has nothing to do with encrypting name resolution. I like pictures, so I threw these together just to kind of visualize. DNS-over-TLS encrypts the name resolution path between your endpoint and the local recursor. This could also be a recursor on the open internet, provided your local service provider does not block name resolutions outside of their network. It really depends on who your ISP is. In certain company environments or universities, etc., sometimes will force you to use their local recursors and will not allow port 53 traffic, or in the case of DOT, port 853 traffic that may be blocked. But if it's configured correctly, your local client will make a regular query to a name server, except the request will be secured by a TLS encrypted. But after that, the recursor still reaches out to the root, to TLD and authoritative, as it would if it doesn't have the information in the cache. Then you got DOH, DNS-over-HTTPS, which bypasses the local recursor infrastructure completely. It essentially uses an port 443 tunnel, if you will, to a recursor on the open internet, typically, that supports DOH, and it looks just like any other TLS connection. From a network management standpoint, it's indistinguishable between somebody accessing a website over HTTPS and making a query. So that's part of the problem. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. The recursor that's out there with DOH support, also, if it doesn't have the answer you're looking for in its cache, will reach out to the roots, TLDs, and authoritative. But the point is that the name resolution path bypasses the local network's resolution that's offered in the configuration there. There's also a possibility of sort of a hybrid approach, if you will. You could, as a network operator, conceivably offer DOH services on the local recursor that you operate. There's nothing technically preventing you from that. Now, how your users would find out about it and would have to configure their browsers to use that name resolution path, there's some effort involved in there. It's not going to be automatic. The popular browsers, Chrome, Firefox, etc., have their preferred DOH providers. Google's 8.8.8 service, Mozilla is partnering with Cloudflare, and Mozilla now by default, if you install it, is enabling DOH to the Cloudflare service. As a user, you can disable that, but by default, that just happened a couple weeks ago, I think. They flipped the switch and now are moving all of their resolutions to the DOH service with Cloudflare. So it's a whole nother discussion about changing a default thing by having users having to opt out versus opt in, but that's not exactly. But the point being is that you could run a DOH resolver or DOH capable resolver on your local network and have your users point at that. And then after that, the recursion goes the same way, root, TLD, authoritative to the local server. But this sort of a hybrid approach that is not as common yet, but it's been pointed out that, this is possible, so I should mention it. It's like, okay, sure, fair point. All right, let's talk a little bit about performance, because when DOH first came out, people were saying like, oh, there's so much overhead shoving, a name resolution into an HTTP packet. It's gonna have dismal performance. You're gonna have, way laggy TTL response time. The round trips are going to be, way longer. It's not gonna work real well. Realistically, if you're on a reasonably good connection, the overhead is fairly negligible. You got to invest a little bit in the crypto for the HTTPS connection, but again, most websites these days use it. Browsers are fairly capable. Unless you're running a system that's like 15 years old as your endpoint, it's probably not going to be making a big difference. Caching can make a difference, near versus far. One of the strong benefits of using your network operator's local recursor is because you have the shortest distance to that. And if that recursor is fairly busy, it will have a fair amount of resolutions already in its cache, so that round trip time is really fast. Normal DNS resolutions use UDP, where DNS-over-TLS as well as DOH use TCP sessions, which have to be established, three-way handshake, all that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit of a performance penalty, but again, from a user experience, it's probably pretty negligible. So I'm certainly not in the camp of saying like, DOH is bad because it's a performance hit. Of course, browsers can, do prefetch and do some browser level caching, although there's other problems with that. So, but it should be mentioned here. The OS can do a little bit of its own caching depending on the kind of services you're accessing, but that overhead and the crypto overhead is pretty negligible on modern hardware. However, I don't think there is much disagreement that a well-designed local caching server will perform better than a cloud-based DOH server because shorter distances, round-trip time of packets, etc. That's just, simple math. If you have to reach further out, it's going to result in a little bit of a delay, but it's unlikely to differ in any significant sort of way. So as far as performance goes, I think traditional DNS and encrypted resolution is probably a 50-50 in terms of what's working better. Security, we're all security professionals, so that's certainly near and dear to us in our wheelhouse. There is an argument to be made that more encryption between the end user and whatever service they're accessing it is a good thing. There's, nation-state surveillance, there's corporate surveillance, the information economy, the more information can be gathered, etc., is certainly concerning. And as the end user, I want to limit as much as possible who has access to my personal data and who is collecting it and making a bunch of money with it. So if I use more encryption in terms of the services that I use, it makes it harder for casual surveillance or in-path surveillance of the things that I do. Using encrypted name resolution certainly adds to that, in that portions of the signal path will be encrypted. Again, if your ISP is, depending on, again, where around the world you're located, they may be a little bit more interested in what users are doing. They may be more monitoring traffic a little bit more actively. However, of course, if the ISP already operates your local recursor, then, by using that for name resolution, they can see all of the names you're looking up. So the local ISP is probably a little bit of a separate beast because they have ultimate visibility by virtue of being the network operator. But once it goes outside of the ISP network, depending on what country you live in, having an encrypted signal path may cut down a little bit on how easily entities that have visibility into the upstream connectivity between your provider and whatever you're reaching is a little, they have a better ability to see that. So by using encryption there, it makes it a little bit harder. There are certificate trust issues. Currently in DNS-over-TLS, there's actually no mechanism to verify that the TLS cert on the recursor. It's not easy to verify that, so you kind of have to be a little bit concerned about man or middling there. I suspect there will be a revision that allows the software to do some certificate validation, but right now that's a little iffy. So yes, your connection is encrypted, but unlike with web browsers, etc., it's not as straightforward to validate the TLS connection that there's not some certificate spoofing issue going on. DNS-over-HTTPS, of course, uses the TLS certificate of whatever the server is that's answering your DOH connection, and you can validate that similarly to if you were to connect to a website using a browser. Since as of right now, the easiest way to utilize DNS over HTTPS is by having your browser support it and having it enabled. The browser handles the whole thing. You'll get a certificate warning if there's something going on. In terms of how somebody might try to figure out which websites you're looking up and visiting, if you are using an encrypted name resolution, you are preventing the question and the answer that you're getting back from being observed. However, if you are then accessing a resource that only supports HTTP, that request is going to go in plain text. So even though more and more website operators are moving to HTTPS as a default, there still is a significant amount of websites out there that don't offer HTTPS or don't enable it by default. You know, if you get your HTTPS all the time plugin enabled, that can help, but there's still a fair amount of resources out there that don't even have HTTPS enabled as a possibility on the web server. So what good is your encrypted DNS resolution if the immediate next packet that makes a connection is in plain text and has the information in there? So that's something to be aware of. If you're concerned about who knows what names you're looking up and what websites you're accessing, at that point, it's definitely worthwhile considering a VPN connection, because then your entire resolution plus the access of the website is kept from the prying eyes of your ISP or your local government, depending. Of course, you have to trust your VPN operator, which is a whole nother kettle of fish. I'm not going to spend too much time going into this because it really is a rabbit hole and we could probably have a whole nother talk on that. But SNI, server name indication, and encrypted SNI is a potential solution to the problem of having the access of a site being observable. There's an RFC for that, but the web server has to be configured for that, which not a lot of them on the whole, as far as, you know, the Alexa top 1 million, et cetera, whatever, goes. That technology is still slowly to be adopted. TLS 1.3 will have something to say about that. Again, not a lot of servers today actually support that. So if and when the needle on SNI and ESNI moves, that'll make a difference. But for right now, because an initial connection to a HTTPS server still has to involve some plain text before the session key can be negotiated, there's a potential of observing at least the initial name when you make a connection, and that's a potential for disclosing name that you're trying to access. When DOH first came onto the scene, I heard a lot of talk about, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to protect, dissidents and hostile territories and make it much harder for oppressive governments to spy on their citizens and potentially, by accessing undesirable websites, get somebody in trouble. I can't stress this enough. Please do not recommend DOH as a solution to a potential dissident, etc. If somebody's life depends on it, DOH will not protect them sufficiently enough. It can help. Don't recommend it to a dissident. They're much better off using something like a VPN or Tor for that matter, because there's just too many pitfalls where a highly motivated oppressive government could still get a whole bunch of information out there. Tor, of course, has its own issues because it's, sometimes it's slow and it doesn't, it's not exactly for the faint of heart at times. It's gotten a lot better. I teach an InfoSec class to undergrads once a year, and I always make them install Tor, go through the whole setting it up, making a connection, just so they get a sort of real world feel for that. And the most recent time we did it, about half of the 35 students in my class got it done pretty easily, but half of them did need help. And these are, 20, 22-year-old young adults that are reasonably technology savvy. So if they have some trouble getting that set up, good luck trying to get your grandma to use Tor. But it's still better than DOH because it tunnels all your traffic from your endpoint all the way through to the exit node, which you have to trust the exit node. But that's, again, a separate issue. Network management, that's... Okay, can you please expand on the disadvantage part? Explain more. Okay, so if you live in a country that has an oppressive government, where by simply accessing websites that are considered undesirable by that government, they may block them straight up. However, new stuff pops up and filters are only so good as the person or script that maintains them. So if you are a dissident and disagreeing with your government and trying to connect with like-minded folks on the internet, and you're trying to get that information out there, chances are you're going to end up on a set of oppressive government's radar, and they might try to monitor your internet connection to see what you're up to. And if you accessing the wrong things or doing the wrong things, you might disappear and never be seen again. So in the early days when DOH rolled out, it was sort of billed as, oh, this is the perfect solution because you don't really have to install additional software. Just have a browser that's capable of it, because VPNs might be banned in certain countries. Also, you can just hide your name resolution in regular HTTPS traffic because it's from a network observational path, it's essentially indistinguishable, especially if a DOH endpoint is commingled with regular website hosting. So, in Google's case, they have made the pledge that they will not commingle endpoints that offer the Google search engine with endpoints that also offer DOH services. So if you wanted to block 8.8.8 from your network, you can without impacting any of the other Google services. On the Cloudflare end, that's a lot more difficult because their DOH resolvers are in IP space that is also used for other Cloudflare services. So if you block that, then you're losing access to a few million websites pretty much right away. So by telling dissidents, oh, just use DOH and all of your traffic, your name resolutions will no longer be observable by the government, I think that's a dangerous recommendation to make because of the SNI issue and of HTTP resources that if you encrypt your name resolution, you then access a site that doesn't offer encryption as part of the access, then whoever's trying to observe your traffic can still figure out which websites you're visiting. And so by simply using DOH is a kind of a false sense of security. I, for many years, worked at a SOC of a major university, and for the last 5 years of that, I ran that SOC. So the responsibility of protecting, 500,000 machines on that network and, user base of somewhere of about 100,000 active users any given day, being able to control the network path and what my users were able to access or not was a critical tool in my tool chest in order to make sure to keep the university safe. We made extensive use of RPZ, a response policy zone in DNS, where essentially you can inject a list of names that you don't want your local recursor to resolve. If I find that there is, a new phishing site or something, I inject it in my local recursive DNS server. And if a user on my network clicks on a link, their system will go out, try to make the name resolution by contacting my local recursor. And if I flag that domain, then they're either going to get redirected to, a server that says, hey, you clicked on something that we don't want you to, call us if you have questions, or it just doesn't resolve, period, and it times out. That is a critical component of managing your local network if you're responsible for it. In DOH, by essentially tunneling through over port 443, I lose that ability to limit what my local users can do in terms of name resolutions. I can no longer block what I deem as the operator of the network resolution of a malicious name through DNS. So that's problematic. If you're working in a highly regulated industry, banking, healthcare, etc., a single click on a malicious link could level, $1 million HIPAA fine and, a consent decree for 3 years of monitoring. So as the local network operator, you really have to have the ability to limit what your users can access. And so the ability to maintain a positive control over the DNS in an enterprise is critical as defenders of the network to be able to do. And DOH kind of blows a giant hole into that. And because certain operators of DOH services do not make it clear which IPs they use for that resolution, it's really impossible to block. Yeah, you could invest, if you have the resources, you could proxy all of your traffic and just man in the middle of every TLS connection and inspect it and see if there's, HTTP, if there's DNS requests in it, and, then just block that. But that's very expensive to do at scale. It slows things down, and you're also running into the issue that you're then having to decrypt every HTTPS connection, which, in a healthcare environment may contain PHI. Then you have to properly secure your proxy, make sure who has access to that, etc. It just adds tons of layers of complexity and expense that if you're able to manage your own local DNS and force all your users to use it, you don't have to invest into that overhead and headache of, trying to man in the middle of every TLS connection. Compliance and certain regulatory obligations make something like DOH really a touchy subject, because if you get audited, having to answer to your regulator why you were not able to block access to this malicious website because there was DOH on your network and you'd not be able to do anything about it is going to be a difficult conversation to have. So DNS firewalls, which are pretty common, which is kind of a step up in terms of manageability from just maintaining an RPZ list on your local recursor. Our solution for that, but again, DOH completely bypasses that because it doesn't use the local recursor where that information could be affected. And in terms of firewalling, again, unless I man in the middle of the TLS connection, it's not really doing anything. Lastly, there is the privacy aspect, of course, which, security and privacy are joined at the hip. They are adjacent for sure, but they have different purposes and sometimes also at odds with it. If something is super privacy focused, it may not be as secure, and vice versa. Ideally, there's a happy medium, and you can implement solutions that both address sufficient enough privacy, but also handle the security aspect. So in terms of encrypted name resolutions, an unlinked UDP versus a TCP streams, if you're able to be in the signal path and intercept a user's connection, you can reassemble TCP streams and gain a lot of information about what a user is doing. DOH and DOT do both use TCP because of the session negotiation and being able to start a TLS connection, where traditional DNS, in the vast majority of cases, uses UDP. And in terms of being able to figure out what somebody is doing, TCP, because of the ability to reassemble sessions, is a little bit more risky there. I don't know that that is by itself enough to, advocate against either one of them, but it is something worth considering because of the nature of the two protocols being so different. One's connection oriented and the other one is just like, fire hose, let it go. The other argument in terms of privacy, and this mostly applies to the United States because I'm familiar with how our laws work here. Other countries have slightly different rules there. But if I'm contracting with my local ISP, I'm paying them money, there are terms of service, there are user agreements, and I can pretty much know what to expect based off the information that an ISP is publishing. If they are telling me in writing as part of this contract that they're not data mining my DNS queries, then that is an enforceable thing because it's a contractual agreement. If they change it or later on get caught doing otherwise, I have technically legal recourse. Now, I'm going to sue my ISP, that's a different story. But in terms of contract language, if I'm paying my local ISP, I should know exactly what they're doing and have some kind of recourse if they're not doing that. So in terms of can you trust your local ISP? Well, it depends on the contract that you've signed with them. A free cloud service, it's a little bit trite, but the old adage goes, if you're not paying for it, then you are the product. If you're using a cloud serviced DOH endpoint, you're not signing a contract with them. You don't have to agree to a user agreement every time you use it. You just ask the question of it, it yields you an answer, and off you go. So it's not super clear what that operator of such set DOH endpoint in the cloud is going to do with your name resolution. You could say, well, all they know is my IP address. Well, of course, they also know your user agent string, and we all know how much of that information can actually be used to identify individual users. And if you're already using some of their other services, you've probably given them enough information that they can very easily correlate by the DOH requests that you're making, what user profile to tie these to. A recommendation often gets made, well, just run your own local recursor and don't worry about any of those things. Well, I actually do run my own local recursor, but it's because we're a DNS company, so it's not something I would just recommend for anybody. But I run a little, Raspberry Pi, and that's my recursor for my network here. But there's an argument to be made that if you run your own recursor and you only have, 3-4 people living in your household, your query volume is low enough that it can actually be more easily identified and picked out, rather than if you're using a recursor that has 1,000 or 10,000 users, where your individual requests kind of blend in the noise. So the argument there is, let's use a recursor out there on the internet that has millions and millions of queries a minute, and you're much more easily able to hide in the noise there. Well, that's all nice and well, but that also creates an aggregation of risk, which we'll talk about here in a second. In terms of privacy on your threat models, depending on who you might be concerned is looking for your data or trying to surveil you, your ISP's recursor, if the ISP is sufficiently big enough, probably provides a decent amount of cover. Running your own local recursor is probably a little bit more risky, just because the volume is low enough where they can easily monitor the traffic that goes out to the routes and TLD servers. So that might make it more easy to identify your queries, even if you're trying to not use a third party's recursor. So there's a trade-off there as well. In conclusion, this is personal opinion. I've been at this for about 20 years, and I get asked a lot of questions by friends, families, etc. And then I teach, so students ask a lot of good questions in that. So I do want to make clear this is my personal opinion, but I do feel strongly about it. Depending on your threat model, encrypting your name resolution may actually not gain you much. You might think encrypt all the things is a good thing, and I don't disagree with that in general. But to utilize encryption of your name resolution, if you don't fully understand what it gains you or what the drawbacks there are, it might give you a false sense of security. So just because something can be encrypted, it's not always adding great value or great protection there. I think DNS-over-TLS is useful, especially if you are in a shared network environment where let's say open Wi-Fi, etc., that kind of stuff. Being able to set what recursor you connect to and encrypting that connection between you and the recursor can be helpful to not have your signal path intercepted on a shared network. So I think there is merit to that. It's not catching on as much as I think some people would have hoped, but I think as a technology, DNS-over-TLS is absolutely useful. As I mentioned before, I personally am cloud averse, and so I have personally a really hard time putting essentially all of my eggs in one basket. So, okay, I use Google search engine. It's great. It's difficult to argue with that. But because of that, they already know a whole bunch about me. And so one of the sort of last missing piece in terms of my, user data profile is like, okay, what websites does this person visit that are not tracked by Google Analytics, etc. So by using, and I'm just using Google as an example, I don't mean to pick on them. So if I now use DOH on the 8.8.8 server, I am handing them one more piece of the puzzle, and now they have all of my name resolution information in addition to all my other browsing habits I already have. So it gives them more intelligence on my likes, dislikes, etc., which all translates into serving more ads and arguably better ads, but I may not want that. So by putting all of your eggs into one basket, there's probably 3 major operators of DOH servers out there right now. There's a bunch of smaller other ones, but if you don't know about them, you can't, use them, or, it's cumbersome to change your browser. So, Chrome is, if you turn it on, uses the Google service. Firefox uses the Cloudflare service. Cloudflare, let's be clear, they're also in the information business. They're hosting a lot of websites or providing them DDoS protection, depending on who you ask. But they're also collecting a ton of information on anybody who visits that website, because they're terminating the initial connection, and so they're collecting a lot of info. So by handing them yet another piece of the information about all of the sites that aren't Cloudflare hosted that you're still accessing is, in the aggregate, a pretty huge thing, and there is money to be made. In terms of, I personally would rather take my chances with my local ISP, which limits the visibility. They can see my stuff, but it's not in the aggregation. My ISP doesn't have 50 million customers. So, but if we all switch over to DOH and pick one of the 2 or 3 providers out there, all of a sudden the world's name resolutions are happening in 3 places. If I'm a government and I want to get a subpoena, by having to go to a bunch of different ISPs and trying to get that information is a lot harder if I just have a one-stop shop, because there is 1 or 2 major DOH providers and I can just subpoena them. I'm making it, in my opinion, too easy on people that are trying to figure out what it is that I'm doing. I also have a real problem on a personal note with forced defaults. I'm not at all happy with what Mozilla did by forcing everybody onto DOH as a default. Yes, you can opt out, but why wasn't I given the choice to opt in? So forced defaults are bad, especially if you're changing a default that at the installation of the browser was set, and then all of a sudden you as a third party, or a second party in this case, I guess, come in and change my defaults. I'm not particularly happy with that. So I used to be a big fan of Mozilla, but that kind of soured me on them a little bit by making that choice for a user, not involving them. And then the whole thing that I'm really big on is there are data brokers out there that are collecting digital profiles on all of us. That's no news, but by handing them yet another piece of the puzzle is, in my mind, something that should be done knowingly and cautiously, and I'm just not willing to do it personally. I see a question or a statement in Discord: Google does absolutely no logging of any kind on 8.8.8. Okay. That's what they're saying. We have to take them by their word. Now, if you read the register the other day, Google also for the longest time claimed that they're not using the identifier in the Chrome browser to do any sort of correlation. And then it turns out they are doing it. And so they had to backtrack on that. So forgive me if I don't 100% believe Google when they're saying, oh, we're never going to do anything with that information. Even if they're not doing it today, all they have to do is change their policy, which I don't have to notify anybody about, and all of a sudden they can do whatever they please with that information, which it's legal, it's their right to do, but forgive me if I don't trust a giant cloud provider when they say something, which there have been several instances where then they later were like, oh wait, we actually didn't mean that. With that, thank you, and I'm certainly happy to take any kind of questions. You need to know what's behind the curtain. It's my ugly office wall that's super busy, and since this is being recorded, I figured that's too distraction, so I hung up a wrinkle sheet.
All right, so sorry, I stepped out to the other room, so I guess we're taking questions now. And are you watching the, oh, here we go. Did you answer this one? Using internal resolvers, how do you block users from using free DNS providers?
No, I did not answer that one. So if you're a network operator, you can certainly block outbound TCP UDP 53. So traditional resolution, you can force people to use your local ones. Blocking DOH is really difficult because it looks just like any other HTTPS request. Now, in Google's case, I will definitely give them credit. They publish their DNS resolvers, and 8.8.8 is definitely the catchiest one. And they have made a commitment to not commingle name resolution services like DOH with any other of their web properties. So you can block 8.8.8 at your border and effectively prevent DOH connections to Google and not impact like Google search, for example. Cloudflare, on the other hand, has not been willing to do that. And so if you block Cloudflare IP ranges, you will probably block access to a few million websites for your users, and that typically isn't tenable.
Okay. And then I had someone just text me a question directly. Sysmon will not detect this either. Like even if you have Sysmon and you're actually watching the browser directly, it's not going to pick it up either, correct?
No, that's correct.
Yep. Okay. Very cool. And then Still Learning asked, if you're trying to monitor someone using DNS maliciously as a C2 channel, what do you recommend? And then Jeff recommended Rita for standard DNS requests. And the only thing that Rita would be able to pick up for this would be the actual beaconing, basically the separate HTTP. Well, that's a good question. With this, is it just establishing one HTTPS session to the DNS resolvers over HTTP? Or is every single request going to be its separate TCP session? Sorry.
Every single request with DOH is a separate TCP session.
Okay.
It does not keep a connection open because it's a one-time resolution, and for state purposes, once the answer comes back, it shuts that session.
So another question, do you know of any group policy templates for people to control their browsers so they don't have DOH?
Not off the top of my head, but I do know they exist, because the way you until now can disable DOH in the browser is in the configuration. And so Mozilla, to their credit, has published information on how to disable DOH, and I think they're actually making some GPO available you can deploy. I've not personally experimented with that. I'm not in a managed domain, so I haven't tried that. But I do believe if you're in a managed workstation environment where you can control the endpoint, you can push configurations to them that actively disables browsers from using DOH.
Now, it looks like the link guy just put up group policy options for everything in about:config, which is your full configuration of your browser. Now, this kind of gets into a bit of a philosophical collision, right? Where, if we're talking about DOH as a security perspective for individuals, we love it because it gives us privacy. But when you're looking at it from the enterprise perspective, all of a sudden that becomes a little bit more of a nightmare. So what is your take on this? Do you look at this one way or the other? Do you applaud the improved security? Is it more of a concern for enterprises to be able to lock down to stop this and have visibility? Where do you stand on this?
I definitely think for the enterprise this is a nightmare, because there is no straightforward way to block it for all of the providers. BYOD is a thing, so even more and more enterprises will start allowing non-managed devices to at least use connectivity from their network. You might not be able to access the restricted areas or the inner sanctums, but nonetheless, if you're processing company data on the device, your email on your phone, etc., it becomes part of the risk footprint of the enterprise. And if I can't control on my network how DNS resolutions are happening, that's a huge blind spot and can potentially incur me huge liabilities in terms of compliance. Somebody mentioned C2 channel communication over DNS. That's a thing. We've already seen malware trying to take advantage of DOH to do their own DNS resolutions to known CNCs that ordinarily I'll put in an RPZ in my recursor, and if my local client tries to reach it, not only will I block it, but I may even alert myself and say, oh, this machine needs to be looked at. It's probably infected because it tried to reach out to this known evil domain. By using DOH baked into malware, there is no way for me to see that. It just looks like another port 443 HTTPS request, and I'm completely blind to it. From a personal point of view, I don't use DOH. Like I said, I run my own local recursor, which is not for the faint of heart. But in general, I would say, at least if you live in the US, stick with your recursor that's provided by your ISP as a personal individual, because you do have a contract with them. And in terms of risk aggregation, you're spreading your risk across a few more places rather than putting all your eggs in one basket.
Cool. And the one thing that I was also thinking about while your talk was going on is you have the about: we were talking about configs.
Yes. And
Jeff just kicked this up. And you can actually view all the requests that are being made or have been made through about: cache. Now, is anybody, or do you know maybe, is there a way that you could forward that cache off the browsers to where maybe you could parse that?
Oh, absolutely. You can access that information with an extension. Now, the user has to give the appropriate permissions, but how many people pay attention when they click OK, accept? The browser extensions can be configured to have access to the full network stack and also to any sort of name resolution that occurs as far as the browser is concerned. And I can collect that information. As a matter of fact, VirusTotal just recently updated their browser plugin, which is it's a good service. I use it. But with the plugin, you can give permission for them to monitor and collect, if you so choose, your local DNS resolutions. I think they're using it for some form of passive DNS based on the local browser, but the capability definitely exists, and it's not inconceivable that there might be a malicious extension out there that slips through the verification cracks and is happily slurping out all that information and sending off to who knows where. So the technical capability exists. So, if it works, the bad guys are going to start using it.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I was just plugging around with Firefox, and it looks like the cache, from what I'm seeing, is there's no IPC support. It's only accessible through the default process. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, we'd have to come up with ways that we can actually pull that off. And we're seeing a lot of people talking about Sysmon. And Jeff's right, Sysmon does log DNS, but Sysmon is not going to log DOH requests.
Correct.
Yet.
Yeah, hopefully eventually, but yes.
So I think that this is definitely an area, I think it's just a matter of time before we get to the point where blue teams have the visibility into this, because I can't see enterprises allowing something like this to happen with zero visibility, especially when so many IOCs are built upon it. So we'll just have to see.
So, for those folks who want to use DOH, no judgment, more power to it. But in the enterprise, if I'm a defender there, this is certainly starting to keep me up at night. I think one way to address it is definitely preventing your browsers from doing that, but with BYOD, that's becoming more and more difficult. Again, I want to highlight that Google using name resolutions on a known set of IPs that, if you want to, can block without impacting other services is a good option. I really wish Cloudflare would be more transparent and say, okay, this is the IP ranges that we're using DOH on. If you don't want your users to access it, you can block this CIDR and, you're home free. But they're not willing to do that. And if you start blocking them, you start blocking access of, millions of websites. And that's just not tenable.
Yeah. Well, and I also, I don't, once again, this is an area that I really, one of the main reasons why we brought this talk in is because it's an area that I just don't know as much as I'd like to know about it at all. And, you talk about Cloudflare, and whenever you have those requests coming in over HTTPS, it could be that those requests are being completely handled by load balancer, and it's going to be commingled with web servers and DOH as well. So it could definitely be a mess moving forward.
Yeah, it's too big to block.
Exactly. So, yeah, and somebody has pointed out what I described as the explicit goal of Cloudflare's DOH servers. But on the flip side, if you look at it from Cloudflare's perspective, not even on the flip side, they have a vested interest in making sure that all of this stuff is undercover so enterprises can't look into it, because eventually that becomes a service that Cloudflare can provide where they're going to handle that type of DNS filtering, quote unquote, for you. All right. So any other questions? Trying to jump in and handle as many of them as I can in two different places. Any other questions or comments? I think there's a lot to think about. I honestly don't see DOH taking over that fast for general population, but I think the biggest concern that I have is right now DOH is something that we see heavily used by people that are trying to skirt around corporate policies, especially whenever I see schools. A lot of schools use DNS filtering to try to protect their students on their networks, and the kids can go in and set this and bypass it right on the fly.
So on that note, it's interesting that Mozilla decided to forcefully opt in all of its users in the US, but they're certainly not doing that in Europe for GDPR reasons. And also there are countries that require ISPs to block certain list of domains, usually child exploitation type stuff. And the operators of DOH don't want to be in the business of having to maintain those lists. So they're simply not turning it on as a default in countries that require that, because it could very easily bypass any of that kind of filtering. So kind of makes me wonder, okay, so it's not good enough for the European Union, but we all just get forcefully opted in. That's kind of an interesting double standard.
Yeah. And some final things, just kind of as a reminder, SensePost has Godot, which I think is fantastic. The whole waiting for Godot references, which is a C2 over DOH, and Spider Labs also has DOH C2. So this will give you an idea of how well your team, as it stands right now, can actually detect this type of command and control. Well, just fantastic. Thank you so much for a good presentation and kind of bringing people's awareness to this. And we'll have to bring you back, and hopefully we can get some more visibility moving forward.
Cool. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.